Bunker Hill did something else. In the meeting of the Second Continental Congress, essentially George Washington is picked to be the head of an army that is designed to defend the colonies, right? Soon to be called states. And of course we refer to that body as the Continental Army. By early 1776, British troops began arriving in larger numbers, principally in the port cities of New York and Boston and Philadelphia. The war takes on a different phase in 1776. Washington's army throughout the course of the latter half of 1775 and first half of 1776 suffers a tremendous number of setbacks, a tremendous number of defeats. It's really interesting that when we see the Declaration of Independence being written by July 4th of 1776, or signed by that date, it's written before, but signed by that date, if we were to look at the American Revolution at that time, if we were a military person, for example, a military historian looking at the Revolution at this point in time, we would say that the colonists have not really achieved any major victories by this period. So, what's the purpose of writing the Declaration of Independence? Why is it such an important component for what we're studying during this period and to the Revolution itself? Well, the Declaration of Independence for the first time put all of the colonies together on the same page. It really made the war effort a war effort for something different, a different country, right? A country with a republican form of government eventually, right? It really gave purpose to what Washington's army had fought those early battles for, and for what had occurred in the fighting in the colony of Massachusetts where the war began. Washington's army wins its first victories at the end of 1776 at two key places, Trenton and Princeton in New Jersey. It's interesting that these victories are critically important in opening up an important year for the American Revolution. Aside from the writing of the Declaration of Independence, 1776 had been an awful year for the American cause. But in 1777, there are a couple of things that happen that are of note to us. First, Americans win a major victory in the Battle of Saratoga. The victory in the Battle of Saratoga convinces the French to jump into the American Revolution as an ally. Why? Because the colonists have demonstrated that they have the ability to defeat a British army in the field. Second, the worst winter of the war occurs after Washington's army fails to defend and then fails to retake the city of Philadelphia at Valley Forge. And during that time, one of the most interesting characters of the American Revolution, the Baron von Steuben, a former Prussian military officer, comes to actually train the Continental Army to be able to fight against the British on their own terms. And it's interesting, after von Steuben's training, the Continental Army doesn't lose battles as it has in the past. Coming out of 1778, the war shifts. In the beginning, the war was fought in New England and in upstate New York. In 1777, 1778, early 1779, the war shifts into Pennsylvania and Maryland and parts of Virginia. But in 1779, with the war being prolonged and their debts mounting, the British begin the process of using what we would call a Southern strategy. Thinking that they could have more support in the South, the British government begins the process of invading the southern colonies in 1779. What this invasion leads to is how the American Revolution comes to an end. First of all, in order to win in the South, the British government proposes the idea of freeing American slaves in the South, if they will come over, switch sides, and fight with the British Army. This is after their appeals of getting Southerners who are living in the back country to try to join the British Army. what this in effect did, and this was occurring a little bit before this as well, when the British step into the South, they step into a landmine. In the beginning, they're able to take the ports of Savannah and Charleston. It looks like the British are going to be on their way to winning the American Revolution. The problem is immigration. Yes, I know. Immigration being the problem in the American South in the last phase of the American Revolution doesn't sound correct, but it actually is. Remember, in the years leading up to the American Revolution, thousands of immigrants had poured into the American South that hated the British government. Now, all of a sudden, the British are invading this territory, right? Hoping to free slaves. And what do? They anger all of these immigrants in the back country of the American South. There had already been tremendous rivalries there, but the vast majority of them now side with the American colonists. And so, essentially, what does the British military do during the last phase of the American Revolution? They create a civil war in the American backcountry. Ultimately, Washington sends one of his most trusted lieutenants into the Carolina backcountry, a man by the name of Nathaniel Greene. This is after the victory at Saratoga. Horatio Gates had been defeated in South Carolina at the Battle of Camden. What's interesting is this. Nathaniel Greene begins to do something that's really sharp, and it changes the focus of the American Revolution. He not only starts recruiting throughout the Carolina backcountry, he starts forcing the British Army to chase him. Greene moves through the Carolinas. The British armies, now under a singular command under Charles Cornwallis, now tries to find a place strategically where they can destroy Greene's army. Two major battles are fought, one at Cowpens and one at Guilford Courthouse. In both battles, the colonial army actually fights the British army to a draw. Meanwhile, at a place called Kings Mountain, in what would be North Carolina today, a group of Tories, backcountry citizens who were loyal to the British Crown, are defeated by backcountry settlers in a major engagement who are on the side of the colonials, or on the side of the patriots, of the colonists. And so what happens eventually, you have one defeat at Kings Mountain in the South, you have two setbacks for the British military at Guilford Courthouse and Cowpens in North and South Carolina, respectively. So the British Army actually moves into Virginia by 1781. Why? It needs reinforcement and resupply. This is where the American Revolution comes to an end. The British Army moves into an area where the first British colony established in North America had actually been located, which is near Jamestown. But they moved to an area of the James Peninsula that's called where the city of Yorktown was at that point in time in 1781. Well, Yorktown's a peninsula. So the British Army moves onto the edge of this peninsula, right, waiting for reinforcement and resupply. Meanwhile, out at sea, the French Navy has scored its first major victory in the American Revolution at the Battle of the Capes. So now the British Navy is not coming to rescue the British Army that is at Yorktown. And through a network of spies and French intelligence, the Continental Army, which had been in New York, by the way, under George Washington, and French troops which have landed in New York under the Comte de Rochambeau, under Rochambeau's guidance, actually move all the way down by a forced march into Virginia, where Washington and Rochambeau's combined army actually surround the British Army at the peninsula at Yorktown, and now the French Navy actually takes over the bay. So, with the surrender of Lord Cornwallis's army on October 19, 1781 at Yorktown, the American Revolution comes to an end on the battlefield. But that's not what the Revolution technically ends with. It ends with the Treaty of Paris of September 1783. And what does the Treaty of Paris do for the Americans? It's a bonanza because they get all of the land, we get all of the land west of the Mississippi River. And we get navigational rights on the Mississippi River through the port of New Orleans, which is owned by the Spanish at this point because of the French loss in the French and Indian War. And so the United States grows tremendously in size because of the American Revolution. However, the American Revolution also led to something else, tremendous debt, and how to deal with it. When the American Revolution came to an end, Americans developed their first identity of what it means to be an American. French visitors such as Antonin de Crèvecoeur are actually visiting the American colonies during this period. And one of Crèvecoeur's first observations was this, that Americans are really a hybrid culture, right? They're not really European. There's something distinctively different, but with European roots, right? Of course, Crèvecoeur's analysis is leaving out Native Americans, and of course it's leaving out the tremendous African American population that would have been slaves during this period for the most part. But though Crèvecoeur doesn't incorporate them in his analysis, he sees that Americans have a type of freedom, right, and a type of desire to have an equality of opportunity that he does not see in other parts of Europe at this time. What defined that equality of opportunity? Well, if you were looking at it when Crèvecoeur is visiting in 1782, 1783, he's essentially looking at the fact that it looks like there's limitless resources and limitless land for these people, bless you, to be expanding and moving into during this period, all right? So I want us to think about this for a moment. I'm going to do this last, right? But the American Revolution for us, almost immediately, does two things. Number one, it does influence other revolutions around the globe, revolutions in places like Haiti and Latin America and even in France itself, right? France went into deep debt assisting the Americans during the American Revolution, and that helped produce their own revolution by 1789. But keep in mind, when the revolution ended, what type of government, what type of political and economic system did the colonies, now states, actually have? Well, we're governed by what is called the Articles of Confederation, which were adopted at roughly the same time as the Declaration of Independence, adopted a year later, written at the same time. The Articles provided for a weak, decentralized government. There was no court system. There was no chief executive. There was no ability to collect taxes. You couldn't create a standing army to defend the frontier. You couldn't, more importantly, regulate interstate trade and commerce. You couldn't regulate foreign trade either. Most principally, you couldn't generate revenue because you couldn't tax, right? So the Articles of Confederation meant one thing that I think is important for all of us to note that are writing this down, we're taking notes, and we're thinking about what's happening during this period. We've just fought a war in which we have tremendous foreign debts from the Dutch, the Spanish, and the French, whom we owe tremendous amounts of money to, who financed this revolution. But that came as state debts, because there was no national government to assume those debts during this period. Also, the states did what? They furnished soldiers who fought in the Continental Army. So there's something else that we have to understand. When the revolution ended, all of the states had acquired different levels of debt. And so therefore, the states also couldn't afford to pay their soldiers during the revolution or for their services after it. So what does this lead to? If you can't regulate interstate commerce and you can't regulate a uniform currency throughout a new country, it almost looked like there were 13 little countries into one, right? It sort of is that because you have a confederation, a loose central government, and really all of these autonomous areas. Well, what does that lead to? Well, it leads to a recession on the one hand, But on the other hand, it's going to lead to something else. A lot of angry former Revolutionary War soldiers who have never been paid for their services, who are now deeply in debt to creditors in the port cities of the new states. That's where Shays' rebellion really comes into play. Shays' rebellion, and it's not unique. There are almost 100 uprisings just like it in the years of 1785 and 1786. Shays' rebellion and the others occur because American farmers, right, cannot make enough money to pay back their creditors, right, that they've bought their land from. And because they can't pay their creditors, right, they're asking the state governments to pay them the money that they feel like they're owed from their services in the American Revolution, and the states who are in such debt can't afford to pay them back. So what we have is a cycle of debt, a major recession by 1786, and major discontent in the new American states. That's the reason why the Constitution was essentially written. So hopefully you guys are writing this down, because this is something that, you know, we got into during the year, but fundamentally I want to re-explain. It's just as much the economics of the 1780s, in other words, that gave us the Constitution, as it was the political weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation. Quite simply, if you couldn't tax, right, if you couldn't generate revenue, if you couldn't regulate trade, if you couldn't keep people from rebelling, if you couldn't keep civil order, you do not have a government. And therefore, you do not have what? A stable country. That's what the Constitution actually did. It actually stabilized an unstable nation, to put it nicely. So the Constitution, written in 1787, this is the easy part, right, gave us a government that was based on the principle of a separation of powers, based on the principle of federalism, and based on the idea that there would be checks and balances within the system of those branches of power. Okay? The major issue in the Constitution's writing was this: how do you represent people in the interest of giving them a voice into that government? In other words, what does this system look like, and how are people going to be able to participate in that system, right? And so the first major compromises that are brokered over the creation of the Constitution are about that. They're about representation. Madison's Virginia plan had originally called for 3 branches of government. It had called for a chief executive, which Madison intended to be a very weak figure. Okay? It's interesting, I digress a little bit, but think of how the founding fathers, as presidents, acted. They were nowhere near authoritarian in the office of the presidency. Why? Because they had fought a revolution to be out from underneath what they viewed as an authoritarian government or system, a monarchy, right? So the branch with the greatest trepidation or greatest fears that were written into it was that of the executive or the presidency. The court system was to be designed later, the Article III branch. But the national court system was to be an important component of the power of the federal government. The branch that received the greatest amount of debate was the legislative branch. Madison's original design for the legislative branch was that it would feature a unicameral legislature, much like the Articles of Confederation government had. One Congress with delegates serving in it that were serving in proportion to the populations of the states from which they came. Small states who had fewer people living within their borders realized that they're constrained by their geographical boundaries and therefore would have less power, and their citizens would have less of a voice in the government. So therefore, Roger Sherman and others, right, Broker, what we think of, we call it the Great Compromise, but we think of it as this agreement, right, that gives us the legislative branch as we know today. That branch looked like this in 1787. It consisted of two chambers, or bicameral legislature, right? The lower chamber was the House of Representatives. They were to be elected directly by the people. Notice one thing about the Constitution. The Founding Fathers have a fear of democracy too. Where does that come from? Shays' Rebellion, right? This fear of people who are uneducated essentially, or in their mind ill-informed, right, who don't have the ability to make decisions for themselves. The House of Representatives is the only popularly elected body in the U.S. government that's written into the Constitution. Judges are appointed through advice by the presidency, and they're confirmed by the U.S. Senate, the upper chamber in the legislative branch. Take care, Carolina. We'll see you tomorrow. And for us, right, senators, the upper chamber in this two-chamber legislature were actually picked by state legislatures until 1913. So there is this fear of the common person and their ability to be able to vote. Why is that? We have to step back for just a second and think about this for just a moment. There are newspapers during the colonial period. There are newspapers during this early Republican period. There are a large number of Americans, however, who are uneducated and illiterate who live in the backcountry. And while the Founding Fathers wanted them to participate in this experiment, there was this fear that they were too ill-informed to be knowledgeable of national issues and issues of foreign policy, right? And so there was this idea that you would do what? You would elect a representative who they would know, who they would have contact with, who can best serve their interests. Therefore, when we look at the Constitution, the House of Representatives is vested with the greatest number of powers in Article 1, Section 8 of the document, okay? Including the power to declare war, the power to regulate interstate commerce, the power also to create agencies for the federal government. We'll eventually get to that here in a moment, right? The Constitution provoked for us the first great political debate in what we should therefore call the history of the United States. And that's over people who want the Constitution and want a strong central government, who we refer to as Federalists, right? And those people who feared that the federal government or the central government would become too powerful and would usurp the interests of the individual states, who we will call anti-federalists, right? They would not have called themselves that, anti-federalists. Rather, they were looking for changes in the document. They feared certain things. And these may sound familiar to you. They feared the power of the presidency. They feared the president becoming a monarch or an autocrat. They feared not just the issue of state power, but the issue of individual rights. So they wanted a Bill of Rights so that the federal government would not trample upon those rights. It's ironic, I think, to us in the 21st century that James Madison feared that state governments would do more to trample the rights of individual people. But these are the great debates of the period, and there's one more. What do you do with the growing slave population that's in the southern colonies, for the most part, during this period? That ended up being a compromise in itself that we refer to, of course, as the Three-Fifths Compromise. In simple language, that meant that a slave was 3/5 of a person, or 60% of a person, as counted electorally in the southern states. Now, at the time, this was done, right, for population balance. That doesn't ever change. The issue of slavery was a divisive issue when the Constitution was written. To make a sports analogy, what did the Founding Fathers simply do with the issue? They punted, right? A Bill of Rights is added to the Constitution by the first Congress when it's seated in 1789. And by 1791, the first 10 amendments of that process have been passed into law. Those amendments, the Bill of Rights, mirror the concerns that the colonists had written in 1776 into the Declaration of Independence. By 1789, the seat of government's in New York. I know that would surprise us today, where George Washington also takes the oath of office as our first president. John Jay becomes our first Supreme Court justice, and the Supreme Court begins hearing cases in 1790. And the first Congress is seated at the end of 1789 as well. Major issues. And let's think about this for just a moment, right? Washington picks the first cabinet for his administration. How much time? Oh boy, we're right here. Can we end with just this one point real quick, and that way we can pick up at a really good place, right? When Washington picks his first cabinet, he's really setting a precedent. And he picks some of the great minds of the period. Edmund Randolph becomes the Attorney General. Henry Knox becomes Secretary of War. But then he picks two brilliant young thinkers, both who come out of the Revolutionary War experience. The first, as Secretary of the Treasury, had been Washington's assistant, his aide-de-camp during the American Revolution. He himself was an immigrant coming from the Caribbean island of Nevis, but you know him as Alexander Hamilton. Also, Washington picks somebody else who he doesn't know whenever he makes this pick is going to become the nemesis of Hamilton's ideas and also ideologically opposed to some extent to Washington's as well. He's the well-experienced Virginia aristocrat, Thomas Jefferson. And we're going to end right there, because picking those two men and the ideological battles that they're going to have is going to define American politics in the 1790s. And to some extent, they mirror the political battles that we still have today. And that major argument between the two is going to be, how much power should the federal government actually have in influencing the lives of American citizens? I think we can stop there.